At the end of this series on the alt-right, I feel it's probably necessary to give a general retrospective. And indeed, in this last segment, I think I'd like this to be an executive summary of all my objections and really crystallize it before I get to my final point. In fact, this has gone on for quite a while. Brevity isn't exactly my strength. So for people who only have time for a 10 or 20 minute video, I think I'd like to use this last segment as a summary, as a means of using all the previous parts to sort of crystallize my final point and final objection to the movement that is the alt-right. So what is the summary of the points made? Well, really, they can be broken down into 6 points corresponding to each of the 6 videos that preceded this one. Starting with 1, the problem of populism. The alt-right will never implement any of its desired policy goals through the application of the democratic process. The current efforts of utilizing a mass movement in order to coerce politicians will fail for several reasons, including an inability of populist movements on the right to bring about any cultural or political pressure onto politicians in the long run, the declining share of whites as stakeholders in political matters just in pure demographic terms, and finally, the disorganization and degeneracy of white populist cultures inside Western societies. Each of these issues totally precludes the alt-right from pursuing any populist or democratic means to obtain power or implement its long-term changes. Number 2, the problem of good leadership. The alt-right cannot recruit or train the highly competent and effective traditional leaders it needs to carry a dissident right-wing movement to victory. Regardless of its ambitions, the presence of incredibly hostile elites makes it utterly impossible to use existing institutions to train new leaders or to convert the present urban elite away from neoliberal orthodoxy. Current leaders and future recruits at this stage are largely taken from the ranks of losers and victims of modernity, and also suffer from many of modernity's largest defects. Training and mentoring a new generation of leaders will be a much larger task than what the alt-right has currently shown itself capable of. Activism is easier than mentoring and cultural creation. Number 3, the problem of pathological leadership. The alt-right will attract sociopathic and paranoid personality types into leadership positions. As the losses of the movement continue to mount and the movement ages, there will be a new demand for leaders who can take action and fight back against the alt-right's enemies. The movement's paranoia, combined with its commitment to an increasingly hypothetical and mythological vision of a white ethnostate, will create an opportunity for sociopathic people and sociopathic forces to seize control of the movement and use it for purposes of self-aggrandizement and self-aggrandizing fantasies, to the expense of the real community, Western civilization, and humanity as a whole. 4. The problem of acceleration. The alt-right's vision of a victory in an accelerated cultural and political decline is misguided and will not come to pass. An accelerated decline of the West removes the issue of slow decline and cucking, but it also creates one large issue, namely the issue of limiting information flow while increasing paranoia and violence on both sides. Such a situation will preclude any attempt to bring a conflict to an orderly end by anything but the strongest leader. Moreover, the situation is more than likely to bring about a civil war where the alt-right itself is feared by groups of people it had planned to count among its own allies. Ultimately, this spells doom for the movement in 2 different scenarios. The first, where cosmopolitan progressive elites crush the alt-right as a final act of spite with their dying breath, and second, where cosmopolitan elites successfully ride out the storm and use the war to re-justify their rule to a terrorized population. In order to succeed in any conflict, a dissident right-wing movement will need to do the following. A. Make peace with non-white and non-Western groups and assure them safety in a new society. B. Come to peace with territorial losses and losses of privilege that have already been forfeited in the current dispensation. And C. Present a new vision of the future that is compelling as the vision of the liberal elites that dissident right-wing movement hopes to supplant. At present, the alt-right does not appear capable of doing any of these 3 things. Issue 5. The alt-right has a fundamental problem with metaphysical motivation, as it fundamentally mistakes cause and effect. Young and burgeoning civilizations are driven by external values concerning truth, goodness, and beauty, which they seek to bring to the world. Race and ethnicity tend to be the obsessions and fascinations of societies already in decline. In short, Racial greatness is brought forth by civilizational commitment to ideals, but racial loyalty, however, does not necessarily lead to any metaphysical value whatsoever. By chasing the concept of race, the alt-right is chasing the shadow of Christian civilization. And finally, the penultimate point 6. The alt-right does not directly address the threat to humanity that modernity poses, not just in fractured and diversified societies, but in homogeneous societies like Japan. Humanity is in a state where it is choking on its own wealth and struggling to find anything of meaning that can drive it forward into the future. In many ways, the alt-right's focus on race in particular creates the easiest and least demanding possible way of organizing humanity. It can be easily sold to individuals since it requires nothing. In fact, racial identity is the easiest metaphysical principle that can be sold to moderns, since it requires no further examinations onto the structures of tradition and mechanisms for bringing forth virtue and the virtuous leaders that humanity needs to carry it into the future and survive. So indeed, these are the objections I have made to the alt-right in my previous videos. But before I go forward and get to really my final point and culminating issue, I think it would behoove us to perform a sort of motivating segue. If we were to look at these objections, look at the problems that we have with the current alt-right movement, and then try to imagine a new dissident right-wing movement dedicated to the restoration of Western civilization, what would we require in order to overcome each of these problems? What would we really need going forward in order to not fall into the same pitfalls and traps that the alt-right has fallen into? I would say, to address each of the issues in order, that first, a successful movement has to occur in spite of popular resentment and exist outside the purview of a mass movement. It must be a countercultural force that can subvert the current ruling class in both its elite and popular form. And it should be a countercultural force that will help populations of lower education and perhaps lower IQ individuals right themselves under the constraints of modernity. Additionally, a successful movement must above all focus on training a new class of competent managerial traditionalist leaders who can direct and mentor their less educated fellow citizens. To this end, a movement must A. Be able to use existing educational institutions as a staging area for the training of new leaders, hiding in plain sight from the authorities. B. Be able to attract already trained professional sympathizers who are dissidents from the current dispensation. C. Be able to build its own separate institutions to foster and train new leadership. And D. Must advance ethical and lifestyle principles that stand against the consumeristic nihilism of the modern age. Only with these principles in place could we hope to see a new set of competent traditionalist leaders emerge. Furthermore, the movement will need to have firm ethical principles in order to focus its efforts on developing community in the here and now, escaping both from the mythical visions of future communities that will likely never occur, and also the paranoid visions of collapse. It needs to protect itself from tyranny by discouraging paranoia and sociopathic personalities that would seek to exploit that paranoia. Moreover, in the event that an accelerating disaster actually does occur, the movement will need the ability to keep its head and to keep its own horses under rein. It will need to be able to let go of things that are truly lost, fight for things that it truly needs, and also reliably be able to make assurances and commitments to peoples and opposition groups that are not yet on its side. It must command the respect of its enemies and also of its fence-sitters, and assure people that it is not an insane group of individuals who cannot be stopped or reasoned with. And finally, from this point, a true dissident right-wing movement that can restore civilization will directly address the fears of humanity, the fears of the world, that humanity will be lost either to an unending series of ethnic conflicts or to the merciless advancement of its own technology and the accumulation of wealth. The fear of an unstoppable decline in humanity itself is a universal fear of everybody in the modern world, and it's one answer that any dissident opposition will need to have. And indeed, if a dissident right movement can accomplish all of these points, I think it does stand a chance against the age to be the force that restores Western civilization. And I think looking at these requirements for a successful movement to restore Western civilization, we can see a common thread that constitutes the final objection that I have to the alt-right. In fact, the main objection that I have to the movement of the alt-right, at least as it conceives of itself now as a racial nationalist movement. And it is really more of a deficiency than anything else, because the alt-right lacks a vision for all of humanity. It lacks some path forward from where we are now. It lacks a story and a narrative that will tell people why it's worth living life, that will tell people why it's worth honoring our ancestors, and why it's worth sacrificing everything for our descendants. Identity politics is easy for a modern when it requires nothing, but when the chips are down, identity politics will do nothing. Only principles will remain. Only some kind of hope for the future will remain. And frankly, the hope that everyone is asking for is not limited in its purview to one particular race or ethnicity. Because in the world that we've created, everyone is lost, everyone is hurting, and everyone is scared. They're all looking for a reason to fight. They're all looking for a reason to hope. And a movement that does not have any answer to that question is horribly unambitious. It can't take the final step that will allow them to dream of some other world better than the one that we occupy. In many ways, I agree that we live in a totally decadent age where consumeristic pleasures are much too plentiful, and the idea that we're going to stay here is unrealistic. But I disagree wholeheartedly that some kind of recreation of Western civilization will be a step backwards, that this will be a return to a more impoverished age, because I feel very deeply that while we have consumeristic wealth in abundance, we live in a spiritually impoverished age. What those looking to restore Western civilization are doing is providing a vision of enrichment, a vision of hope. But that's a narrative you won't see in the alt-right, at least not presently. All we hear about is talks about zero-sum games, about what ethnicity has what. And indeed, that is an important question for the conflicts that will come, almost certainly out of our present age. But it's not the story that humanity needs to move forward. It's not the story that we need to move forward recreating the civilization that was lost in the previous age. It's not a zero-sum game. And just to provide a tidbit, we can see, at least in the abstract, that it's not zero-sum, because there are many ways in which the manifest overpopulation of the third world and the manifest inability of the first world to continue itself on intergenerationally are two sides of the same coin. The third world African is suffering from an underabundance of consumer wealth, and that's transferred only into the creation of new generations who have an increasingly small share of that coveted consumer wealth. While on the other hand, Western families are choking on their own consumer wealth. They have such an easy ability to consume and such a difficult time actually gaining the ability to carry forth the families that would give them meaning, that would give their civilization and societies the ability to continue on, to survive. In some ways, one could imagine a solution in which a worldwide leader fixed both problems, leveled out the growth of the third world, and fixed the overconsumption of the West in one fell swoop. But this here is not my point. My only point is that the asymmetries and the modern problems of our economy and nihilistic worldview are manifest across the globe, are manifest independent of the cultures and races we inhabit. Humanity wants to find somebody that will help it save its soul. And to bring up another example, we need look no further than Islam. I mean, Islam is not fighting to create an ethno-state for Arabs, it's fighting for the souls of the world. It at least has a solution, however squalid I and many other people might think that is. The current crisis we are experiencing is not just about the decline and disappearance of the white race. It is a war for the soul of humanity, and a movement bearing for such a solution will win not only a future for their own people, but will also provide a new vision for our planet. And that is something that I hope to see. There needs to be a new vision of the future, a new faith, a new hope for what is to come, and perhaps even a new battle cry. And here, I can't help but end on one final analogy and one final example. Because when I said battle cry, I immediately thought to myself, the alt-right turn of phrase Deus Vult, or God wills it, a battle cry that supposedly crusaders screamed while marching into battle, and what the alt-right hopes will be a counterpoint to the Islamist Allahu Akbar, or God is great. Now, setting aside for a moment the fact that I think Deus Vult is garbage theology, and in fact I'd prefer Allahu Akbar. I mean, God is great is a correct theological statement. Deus Vult means God wills it, which is questionable at best. The fascination with Deus Vult kind of indicates a supreme misunderstanding, not only of how theology and metaphysical motivation works, but even of how the Crusades were motivated. Even what motivated late medieval Western civilization to flower forth into the Renaissance that provided us with everything that we know and have and love today. The Crusaders may have yelled Deus Vult, considering their own mission to be a holy one. But the attentive student of history will realize instantly that there is a reason why Christians in subsequent centuries and Christians of the modern day have never clung to that formulation. And when Christians have looked back on the Crusades fondly, they fastened upon another expression, one that was said to have been prayed and sung after the knights won their victory, and has subsequently become a pious prayer of Christians everywhere. And that is the prayer Non Nobis Domine, sed nomini tuo da gloriam. Not unto us, Lord, not unto us, but to thy name give the glory. And here I think we can reflect upon this prayer, this hymn, as the basis of a civilizational restoration, much more powerful than the cheap one-liner of Deus Vult. We set out on the mission to achieve something not for ourselves, not even for the group that we represent, not for our race, not for our nation, but for something higher. And when we achieve whatever greatness we have to give the glory back. We have to acknowledge our own humility. We have to not be consumed by the past greatness, to send good money after bad, to send our current civilizational possessions to preserve temporal glory that was by its very definition not going to last. The ideal, the eternal, the true, the good, and the beautiful are the things that are worth fighting for. They are the first things. They are the seeds of civilization from which all other well-being springs forth. If we seek goodness and holiness, then well-being and life for our own groups will spring forth, but reverse the process and only death will result. I know that a lot of people are going to be hearing this pronouncement and dismiss it as me trying to smuggle religious motivations into a talk that's basically about politics and political predictions. But it's something that I and many other people in the past have believed. And I think history bears it out, because as I look at all the previous greatness of Western civilization, of European civilization, of Christendom, I do not see a culture and a people crying out, God wills us to succeed, God wills us to win. Instead, I hear and I see the evidence of a more gentle prayer, one that speaks non nobis Domine, not for us, O Lord, not for us, but to thy name give the glory.